Adam Golov, Marketing and Communications Manager at Data Conversion Laboratory, and I'll be your moderator today. Before we get started, I want to let you know we will allow time at the end of the webinar for questions and answers, so please write your questions in the chat area as they come to mind. If we don't have time to answer them all, we will make them available on our website. For those of you who are not familiar with DCL, we convert and organize content to create electronic documents, populate databases, publish on the web, and basically get it ready for tomorrow's technology. Next slide, please. DCL services help you refine your document conversion strategy, identify a document redundancy, extract metadata, and transform legacy and future documents for real needs, today and in the future. Next slide, please. DCL serves a broad client base. Next slide, please. Spanning all industries. Today we are thrilled to introduce Kerry-Anne Gilloway, Content Strategy Consultant. Kerry-Anne lives in Cape Town, South Africa, where she has been working as a content strategist since 2009, first as the owner of a small content development agency, and for the last 2 years as an independent consultant. She's spoken at several user experience and content strategy conferences in the United States, UK, and Europe, including the Information Architect Summit, the Midwest Users Experience, Content Strategy Forum, Confab London, and the Online Content Strategy Summit. Kerry-Anne started the Cape Town Content Strategy Meetup Group in 2010, and in October 2012, she hosted the International Content Strategy Forum conference in her hometown. She has also twice been part of the volunteer team at the Confab Central event in Minneapolis. Without further ado, welcome Kerry-Anne.
Thanks so much, Adam. It's really great to be here today, and thank you very much for introducing me. Thanks also to everybody who's joining us today. It's very unusual for me to be speaking to a group of people that I can't see, so I'm just going to have to imagine you all laughing at the appropriate places and shaking your heads and nodding your heads in agreement at all the right places. So firstly, there's something that you need to know, which, as Adam mentioned, I'm in Cape Town in South Africa, so that means firstly I'm in a very different time zone to you, well, probably to most of you. I'm assuming that a lot of you are in the US. It's 8 p.m. here, so starting to get dark. But the other more important thing probably is that we're in the opposite season, of course, to the Northern Hemisphere at the moment. So while a lot of you are probably watching the snow falling or thinking about the snow starting to fall, I am sitting here perspiring because it's really, really, really warm and we're in the middle of summer at the moment. So let's talk about content essentials and getting back to the basics of content strategy. Let's start off with a question. And the first question that I want to look at is, why has content strategy suddenly become, it's a word that we're suddenly hearing far more of, and we're seeing it all over the place. People are talking about this thing. But the thing is that it's not new. Content strategy isn't a new concept. It's been around for a long time. There are people in the industry who've been doing this for 15 to 20 years, some of them under different job titles, but many of them have actually been calling it content strategy. So why is it that this thing is suddenly something we're talking about so much? Why has it suddenly become so important? Well, it's mostly because of this, the World Wide Web. Because here's the thing, organizations have been preparing their content in silos for many years, but now these silos have become visible. And this is the problem. The silos have become visible because of the web, because suddenly the web makes everything that you do internally completely visible to your customers and your audience. So a lot of organizations have always been dysfunctional and have been working in a very siloed way. But the thing is, it didn't matter as long as their storefront looked good and actually see what's going on behind the scenes. Christina Halvorson once said in a talk that she was doing previously, we could just put it in an envelope and mail it to them. That's how we could treat our content in the past. We could just mail it to people. They didn't have to see everything else. They didn't have to see how the pieces all connected. But now they do see the pieces connecting, and it's often not a very pretty picture. So what's happening? Well, organizations are feeling the pain because of the advent of the web and all the other digital channels that we have. Their structure is becoming visible and their dysfunction is becoming visible to their customers and their audiences. So they're feeling the pain of all this content and having to deal with content. And the thing is that nothing they've done up until now has actually really fixed their problems. So organizations are throwing their hands up in the air and saying, why hasn't SEO fixed our problems? We spent so much money on it and it hasn't solved our problems. Why haven't our users generated all of our content for us? This is what we were told when we got a Facebook page and when we started blogging. We asked our users for their stories and we were told that they would write all these fantastic stories and we could just use those as content, and they would tweet and we could just retweet them and they would create all our content. But that's not what's happened. So nothing that organizations have really tried has actually fixed the real problems. But hang on a second. What's happening here? We've got new channels, new devices, new platforms, so many new opportunities. And what does this mean to the organization? It means we get another chance to impress our audience and fix everything. Woohoo! So somebody says, we need a blog. Somebody else says, we need a Facebook page. Somebody else says, we need to write articles. And then the CEO comes along and says, we need an iPad app, right? So there's this proliferation of platforms and channels and devices these days, and because of that, all our publishing and content decisions are getting made haphazardly. They're being made in a fragmented and a reactive way. We're reacting to what we see. We're doing what everybody else does. We're not actually using any kind of framework to make our decisions. So what are we neglecting? As we chase Cola and Red Bull, and we chase after engagements and likes and page views and better content and even more content, what are we neglecting in that rush? What about all the boring bits that actually do matter? Let's take a look at some of them. The first thing that we tend to ride roughshod over is the actual needs of our audience members. So what do? We give them infographics when actually they need opening hours and contact details. And we give them engaging, quirky Facebook updates when really what they need is to know how long it'll take for their package to be delivered. We give them brand stories and cute holiday greetings when they need the information on your website to line up with what the call center agent is telling them. So while we're busy lamenting the latest changes that Facebook has made to the way pages work, we forget to actually listen to the voice of our customer. And they're out there saying, hello, can anyone hear me? Is this thing on? Can you actually tell what I really need? So we get caught up in exploring just how many channels we can use to communicate with people, and we don't spend enough time considering what it actually is that they need from us. We don't ask questions like, what content do we need to include on our website? What do they actually need from us by email? We're emailing them all the time. We're sending them fabulous newsletters and really exciting information, according to us, but is it what they really need? If our customers do actually want to hear from us on Facebook, for example, well, what is it that they want us to say to them on that platform? What is it that they actually need from us there? We don't stop to consider their context, to actually understand, spend time understanding what their lives are like when they visit our site, what they're using our site for, and what else they might be doing while they're reading our tweets, for example. We don't stop and think about what their lives look like. And more than that, we don't think about how we actually fit into their world. An example of this is when organizations use the phrase, we apologize for the inconvenience. So we're having a kind of a national crisis at the moment here in South Africa with our electricity provider, our national electricity provider called Eskom. And the problem is that all our power plants are having maintenance issues and so on. They haven't been properly maintained over the years, so we're having quite a problem at the moment. And what they're having to do is something they're calling load shedding, which is basically planned power outages, rolling power outages. Fortunately, there weren't any today, which is why I'm able to speak to you. But the problem is, this is really affecting people's lives, as you can imagine, when the power is out for 2 hours at a time, sometimes up to 3 or 4 times a day. And Eskom, on their Twitter account, they've been apologizing to everybody for the inconvenience. Now, this is not an inconvenience. This is a national crisis. This is a huge problem. It's affecting all kinds of things, productivity and so on. And they're vastly underestimating how important this is to us by apologizing for the inconvenience. On the other hand, when you make a huge issue out of something that's gone wrong, when actually it's such a minor thing in your customer's life, then you display how self-absorbed you actually are as an organization. So this works both ways. You can either underestimate or overestimate how important you are to your customers and how you actually fit into their world. So the whole thing here is that unless you speak to your customers and actually spend some time understanding them, you're going to end up starring in that well-known hit movie, Crouching Customer, Hidden Needs. Because the thing is that smarts and assumptions will only get you so far. You aren't your target market, and this is something that we say often, but we really need to take it to heart. You are not your target market. And yes, you're probably working in this industry because you are a smart individual, but that's only going to get you so far. We can begin with assumptions, but we have to recognize that that's what they are, and we need to move beyond them and really make an effort to understand our customers. The next thing that we tend to neglect in this rush to be exciting and relevant is findability. So once you know what your customers actually need, well, can they find that information? And I'm not talking about SEO, because I think we've spent a lot of time, there are a lot of people who do talk about that. We've spent a lot of money, certainly in South Africa, a lot of money has been spent on SEO. I'm talking about once people are actually on your website already. Can they find the information that they're looking for easily and with minimal frustration? Let's have a look at a couple of examples. Site search is broken. This screenshot is a search that I did on a local alcohol retailer's website. I was looking for cider, and that was the word that I typed in, cider. And I got the following search result. It said, your search for cider did not match any products. Did you mean to browse one of the following categories instead? Cider. Did you mean to browse one of the following brands instead? Red's cider, Hunter's dry cider, Hunter's Strongbow, which oddly enough are all brands of cider. But my search didn't match any products, and of course they had all these products on their website. So that tells me that somehow their tagging and their metadata is not functioning as it should, because they returned null search results when actually there were very clearly results that were entirely appropriate for what I was looking for. This is another example on one of our local tech retailers' websites. I searched for MacBook Air Ethernet adapter. On page 1, I got the following results. Samsung air purifier, a VGA adapter cable, at least it had the word adapter in it, to be fair, an Xbox game, and a backpack. Now this is on page 1, so the natural assumption that you're going to make is, well, they probably had nothing that was even vaguely related to an Ethernet adapter. As it turns out, they didn't in fact have a MacBook Air Ethernet adapter, but on page 5 they did have some things that to me seem a little closer, like a wireless router and a portable drive and so on. So an Apple iPad, which at least is a Mac product. So they had some things that were slightly closer. So why on page 1 was I getting results for an air purifier and an Xbox game when on page 5 I got something that was at least in kind of the same region, a router or a modem? Again, it's because their metadata is not correctly set up. The products are not, the content is not properly modeled. So it also tells me that the people who designed the search functionality and the people who created the content did not sit down together in a room to discuss how this is all going to work. So potentially one group of people, the developers, wrote the algorithm for search or implemented it, and another group of people created the content, and they never discussed how these two things were going to fit together. So that's a workflow problem. We're going to get to that a little bit later. But it's not just search that's broken, not just site search, it's also navigation. Navigation is broken too. This is a screenshot from one of our local banks. And well, all financial services websites look like this. This just happened to be an easy one to get a screenshot of because it was nice and compact. But really, I could go to almost any one of them. So I'm not picking on them. They're all equally bad. Those are all the navigation areas. There are 8 different sets of navigation on this page. So sets of navigation. That's not counting drop-down menus. That's where I have to start when I want to find what I'm looking for. I have to first pick which of those 8 is actually the appropriate one for me to be looking at before I can even begin looking for the information I need. And I think that one of the reasons that this happens is because we've bought into the lie about the 3-click rule, where any information should never be more than 3 clicks away for the user. And that's been proven to be a lie and a myth. Because the really important thing is that users feel that they're on the right track. They don't mind how many times they click, as long as it's not frustrating, as long as they feel that they're actually making progress and getting closer and closer to their goal. But because organizations have bought into this three-click rule lie, try saying that fast 3 times, because of that, they feel that they have to create all these menus on their homepage because everybody needs to find what they're looking for no more than 3 clicks away from the homepage. So they create all these navigation areas and end up completely baffling us, and we get lost and frustrated. The next thing that often gets neglected is voice and tone. Consistent voice is really important. I don't know how many of you remember Horse eBooks. If you don't, Horse eBooks was basically a bot that used to tweet these bizarre things completely out of context, but every once in a while it was just this little word of wisdom, and I thought this was one of them. Voice, voice, voice. It's like estate agents, real estate agents who talk about location, location, location. Well, so it is for content people. It's voice, voice, voice. Those are our magic words. And it's really important to have a consistent voice across all your channels. So if you are going to be on Twitter and you are going to be on Facebook and you also have a website and maybe a call center, it's really crucial that your voice is a consistent organizational voice across those channels. Of course, you'll vary tone for different contexts. So in help content, for example, you're not going to be particularly salesy, so you would vary your tone, but it's still the same voice. And there are way too many social media accounts in particular where the voice that's reflected does not match the voice that you see elsewhere from the same organization. But it's more than just about discovering your own organization's voice. It's also about the type of language that your audience relates to. So we're going back to audience needs here. So this cat, for example, says, I like a really comfy, snuggly, wuggly blankie. This one, on the other hand, has a preference for deep pile microfleece bedding material. Okay, those are 2 very different cats, and they are my cats, so I can tell you that they are indeed very different, and they have completely different personalities. One is certainly more snooty and technical than the other. And it's really important that you don't ignore the kind of voice that your audience responds to, and perhaps you have multiple audiences. You need to be cognizant of that and speak to them all in a way that is appropriate to them. Unfortunately, we also very much and very often neglect basic user experience. Let's have a look at a few examples of ways in which content can cause a poor user experience. Confirmation screens. This is, I was booking tickets for a movie, to go and see a movie at the cinema, and they asked me, how would you like to receive your confirmation? Print or, don't appear to be any other options. So I guess print. Error messages. This is a huge one, and this is certainly by far not the worst error message I've ever seen. I have seen plenty that are much, much, much worse than this. But this one is interesting because what happened here was I had booked a flight on British Airways, and I wanted to change the date of the flight. Now, if you change your flight online, there's no change fee, right? But if you call in to change it, there is. You pay a certain amount of money to actually change the flight. So naturally, I was going to change it online, but then I got this error message. Sorry, we have encountered a problem. Please call your local British Airways office to change this booking. Now the problem from my perspective here is that this doesn't tell me what the problem is. I have no idea what's gone wrong and why I can't make the change. So now what happens is that I have to call the British Airways office, as they've suggested, and explain that the site encountered a problem. Now, they're asking me what kind of problem, and I can't tell them. And I have to persuade them that actually it really did encounter a problem and it's not my fault, because otherwise they're going to charge me, because they charge for changing your booking online by phone. But the problem is, of course, that the call center agent has never seen this screen in their life before because they work in the call center and not on the website. So they don't understand when I say that this is all the information I got. In this particular instance, I actually ended up having to send them a screenshot of this page to prove that I really had tried and there was an error. So the problem with error messages happens when we don't give enough information. We don't give the context. I mean, sometimes it's sort of some kind of long string of letters and numbers, you know, which tells you usually that the developer has written the error message, and I don't blame them for this. It's not their job to do it properly, but that's what happens, and then we don't have enough information, so your user is kind of left stranded and they don't know how to correct the problem. Another area of user experience that is becoming increasingly problematic, I think, the more channels we have, is the problem of cross-channel consistency or lack of consistency. What happened here was that I needed to apply for a visa. For those of you who live in the US, you would not need to apply for visas very often for travel, but living in South Africa, we have to get a visa for most places that we travel to. And this particular one was for Europe. I was going to Germany. And applying for a visa is already quite a process. It takes a lot of time and you have to gather a whole lot of paperwork. So there's a lot that goes into it. It's a very frustrating experience already. Now, before you can go in for an appointment for the visa, you have to complete an online form. So I duly completed the form. One of the questions on the online form was whether or not I had biometric data gathered by the Schengen visa authorities in the last 5 years, which I had because I'd been to Paris about 4 years ago. So I said yes. And then there was another question that asked whether I had actually applied for and received a Schengen visa in the last 3 years, which I said no, because I have not. I traveled 4 years ago. When I got to the appointment for the visa, the lady that was helping me said to me, she looked at me a little strangely and she said, I don't quite understand what's going on here, because you said that you had biometric data taken, which is really just fingerprints. And she said, but we don't have anything on the system. You didn't have this done in 3 years ago. So I said, no, I had it done 4 years ago, which is what the form online asked. And she said, oh, no, we need it to be 3 years or less. So the form, the online form, actually didn't tie up with what the reality of the situation was. They asked me whether I had the data taken within 5 years, which I had. It turned out I actually needed to have had it taken in 3 years. Now, that's not really a big deal, except for the fact that this requires a payment, and they only take cash. And I very seldom carry cash because I mostly use a credit card. Luckily that day I had just enough money and could scrape it together. The problem is that if I didn't have that cash on me, I would have had to actually make a new appointment and go back half an hour away from where I live on another day to have another appointment. So what seems like a very, very tiny thing can actually lead to considerable inconvenience in somebody's life. Another area of user experience that we overlook is file names. I don't know how many of you receive statements by email, but it's becoming increasingly common here. The problem is that I receive most of my statements now, my bank statements and credit card statements and so on, by email, and they're all just called statement. which means I have to rename every single one because, of course, I can't tell the difference between that statement and this statement, whereas from the company's perspective, they see it from their point of view. They're sending me a statement, so it seems obvious that they would call it statement. Not at all obvious when it's me. I need the company's name and I need the date and all those kind of things in the file name. So this is, again, a really small area that actually just builds up and becomes quite an irritation in your user's life. This is an example that I actually don't enjoy using because it's kind of an awkward one. But it's about URL structure and showing why URL structure is so important. This was when Robin Williams committed suicide, and the week after somebody tweeted this. Martin Bellum tweeted, "Robin Williams and why funny people kill themselves," and there was a link to a cracked.com article with the subfolder quick fixes. And Martin said, this is why URL structure has to be part of your content strategy. Because, well, I think it's pretty obvious. Not cool. And there are many, many, many examples of this kind of thing. Most of them are not safe for work. This one happens to be, but it's a very unfortunate problem. Digital document design is another area of user experience that we overlook. This is a screenshot from one of my credit card statements online. Well, it's not the statement, it's actually just sort of the running list of transactions. When I log in, I can have a look at them. The problem is that they've designed this in such a way that they don't ever show whether it's a debit or a credit on the account. So I can't tell whether Airbnb charged me twice or charged me once and refunded me once. I really can't tell because there is actually no way of seeing. And you might look at this and say, well, that's kind of an interaction design problem. It's not really a content problem, surely. Well, if it's not a content problem, then whose problem is it? Somebody has to take care of these things. And often it's up to us as content people to notice things that are otherwise going to slip through the cracks. Oh, and if you're looking at that number and you're in the US or Europe and thinking, goodness me, how did she spend so much on Airbnb? Just remember that the exchange rate is around 11 Rand 50 to $1. So divide that by about 11 and then you'll get the actual number in dollars. So don't worry. All right, so we've had a look at all these things that we tend to neglect. So the question then is, what should we actually be focusing on first before we rush out and create all of this fancy content, all these infographics and these social media updates and fancy articles and all kinds of custom publishing and so on? What should we be focusing on first? The first area of focus should be getting clear about your core content strategy. I mentioned earlier about how publishing decisions are being made so haphazardly because of this proliferation of platforms and channels and so on. And we need to be making these publishing decisions as a part of a framework. We actually need a framework for making decisions about publishing. And that's what your core content strategy is going to give you. I really love this quote from Sarah Wachter-Becher, who's an independent content strategy consultant and also the editor-in-chief at A List Apart. She's had this in a presentation recently, common ground before content. And what she means by that is before we even start thinking about what we're going to write or produce or create, we need to establish that actually all stakeholders have common ground. We're actually all on the same page. We're all heading towards the same goals and objectives, independent of what content we're going to be creating. And this gives you the framework. So once you actually have that core content strategy and you really understand what it is that you're heading towards, what your goals are with your content, then every time that somebody suggests something, every time someone comes along and says, you know what, we should really put up a Facebook page and here's the type of content we should produce for that Facebook page, you can stop and you can ask, how does this feed into our overall business and content strategy? You need to document this, and it doesn't need to be complex. Depending on your resources, of course, you can invest as much as you can in it. But even if it's just 2 or 3 basic sentences to actually have a very clear picture of your direction and your goals with your content, then you've always got this as a guideline. You can always refer back to it, and you should. You should check how every step, every idea, every suggestion, how it actually lines up with your overall content strategy. Also, as part of your strategy, you should be looking at messaging. So you should be defining and determining what it is that you want to portray as an organization. What are the messages that you want to put out there? What are the things that you're currently putting out? What do you not want to be saying about yourself? How do you want people to view your organization, your brand? This is all really crucial to determine up front. The second focus area is the way that you think about and position content. So in the past, organizations, well, in fact still today, organizations tend to function in silos. They've functioned very much along these vertical lines. A lot of organizations are changing, and yours might look very different depending on what industry you're in. But roughly speaking, this is the typical sort of organizational structure where we have these different silos and things really happen within these verticals. And here's the thing, content used to belong exclusively to the marketing department. And we called it copywriting. Now, this ad is absolutely terrible because it makes no sense to me. I have absolutely no idea what the copywriter was going for. I'm certain there's some kind of hidden joke that I am just completely missing, and if there is, please would one of you tell me what it is, because I really can't see it. But this is what we used to consider. This was content. Content was copywriting, and it was purely a marketing function. That's where it lived and where it belonged. So let's go back to our silos and our verticals. The thing is that content now is a business asset, and it stretches all the way across an organization. It doesn't live in one silo. It stretches right across. Here are some examples of the kinds of content that you might find across an organization. These are just some very, very limited list of examples. So sales and marketing would have marketing copy. Sure, we're all familiar with that. Finance might have forms that customers need to complete. That's also content, how those forms are labeled, how they're designed. IT might be responsible for interface copy, both in external systems and internal systems. So admin panels that are used internally, there's interface copy that lives on those. HR maybe owns intranet content. So HR actually owns content now. Legal will have terms of service and contracts and that sort of thing that they're responsible for. Operations could have call center scripts or email scripts or text messages that they send out. So this is how content stretches across an organization. It's no longer just about marketing. And all of these things need to relate to one another. But let's move out a little bit. Let's move out a few paces and have a look at a website. Many of you will probably recognize this. It's the REI website. And this is not your grandfather's website anymore. In the past, and still for some organizations today, a website is a brochure. It's a marketing brochure. It's something that has marketing content and is used as a sales tool. But that's not what's happening here anymore. REI, their website now functions in so many different ways. They have a travel agency that they're running through this website. There's an outdoor club. They have an advice column. Their website is a point of sale, of course, because they're doing e-commerce. It's a financial management portal. You can apply for a card right there on the website. There's a legal contract on the site in terms of their terms and conditions and so on. In fact, there are multiple legal contracts on the site. And it's also a customer care platform. It doesn't just belong to one department anymore. And that's true for most websites, especially for larger organizations. It no longer belongs to just one department. You might have a team that's responsible for actually keeping this whole thing together, but the ownership of these different pieces and the content that belongs to each is scattered across the organization. And here's how it looks for your customer. Investing online is great until I want to talk. Your customer might want to hop from channel to channel. They don't see it as an individual channel. They just see this as an interaction that they're having with you across multiple platforms. So that means that if one department, let's say marketing, owns a single channel, like the website, then they define the customer experience for that channel, but not for the rest of the customer's interactions. And that's what leads to a splintered overall experience for many customers. Because here's the thing. It's no longer about the structure of your organization. It's about your customer's cross-channel journey. So that might mean that you have to re-examine who owns what. Product and process owners may need to take responsibility for their own content under some kind of umbrella team or committee or so on that's responsible for web content. But the whole point is that this is not just marketing's job anymore, because there are too many other pieces that are involved, too many other departments, too many other verticals have a stake, have a very, very real stake in your online presence. I love this quote from Erica Hall. It's something she said in a talk a few years ago. Erica is the co-founder of Mule Design and the author of Just Enough Research. And she said the end product isn't great content, it's a great thing. And this is so important. Content needs to be inextricably tied to the rest of the experience. We're not fighting for content to be the main thing that we have going for us. We're fighting to actually create a great experience, a great thing for our customers and our audience. Let's look at the next focus area. The next focus area is user research. We spoke a little bit earlier about audience needs and how we tend to ignore our audience needs. So many of you might be familiar with that old story about Henry Ford, who reportedly said that if he'd asked people what they wanted, they would have said faster horses. And people use that as a reason to not ask their customers and their users what they want, because the thinking is, well, they're just going to tell us that they would prefer the website to be green. And while there's some merit in that, the truth is that you can absolutely ask your customers and your users what they want and what they need. You just need to learn to read between the lines. So if indeed somebody had said that to Henry Ford and he had actually listened, then he would have heard that what they were saying is not specifically that they wanted a faster horse, it's that they wanted to move faster. And therefore, building them an automobile would have been a perfectly valid way to deal with that. So it's about listening to what they're actually saying, interrogating what their real reasons are for asking for a particular thing. Let them ask for features by all means, but understand what it is that they're going to get out of that feature. What is it that they're looking for? So yes, you can speak to your customers and you can get real value from that. One of the things that you might want to understand as a content person is what words do your customers prefer to use? We spoke earlier about the type of language, but there's also this issue around actual vocabulary and their actual lexicon. What words are they using to refer to things? You know, a very common example of this is banks that refer to products, but I don't think of my bank account as a product. They do, but I don't. So there's a real disconnect there in terms of terminology. And you need to understand, in order to label things properly on a website, you need to understand how it is that customers refer to things. So some of the things that you could make use of to get at this information, one-on-one interviews. I'm a huge proponent of doing one-on-one interviews with people because you get a lot more information that way than through workshops or focus groups or so on. Site search logs are very much an undervalued tool for getting at what it is that your customers really want, because you know what, they're telling you exactly what words, what information they're looking for and what words they're using to find that. So it's a really, really, really useful resource to go through your site search logs. Call center logs, speaking to the people who are actually talking to your customers when they call in and they're angry and they're complaining because they haven't found something or because you've let them down in some way. This is again something that is really underutilized. Speaking to people who actually are in customer service, you know, talking to your customers all day. Web analytics, I think we tend to over-focus on this at the expense of some of the other things, but it can be useful as long as you know how to, again, read between the lines properly. And content testing, just in the same way as you would do usability testing, you can also devise tests for your content to make sure that people understand your content, that they can find what they're looking for, and so on. So those are all ways of uncovering your users' needs. Focus area number 4 is the efficiency of your content workflows. So that's what the content creation process looks like. Someone has a fabulous creative idea right on cue, then magic dust is sprinkled, words pop out and form themselves into orderly sentences, the unicorns dance in a circle, and we have content, right? I mean, that's how it works for everyone. No. Unfortunately not, because most organizations don't have unicorns and magic dust is getting rarer and rarer. Creating content actually takes time, a lot of time, and it takes people. And unfortunately, a lot of people in management and higher areas of management don't always understand this, and this is a message that we really do need to communicate, that content is expensive to produce, good content anyway. And it needs to be written into people's job descriptions. You cannot expect people to just add on their content creation duties to the end of their long, busy workday where they were actually fulfilling their primary job function, and now you're expecting them to write content as well. It doesn't work. It actually has to be written into job descriptions, and there needs to be an understanding of just how time-consuming it is. One of the problems we have with workflow is that content people are not brought in early enough frequently. So this is the way that it always worked. People would call the copywriter in right at the end once the website had already been designed and there were just some boxes that needed to be filled with words. And that's what would happen. We'd be asked to fill in these boxes and produce copy for these websites. And then the copy wouldn't fit because maybe there were too many products and not enough product boxes or whatever. There are all kinds of problems with doing it that way. And content people are not involved in the analysis and the thinking part of the work. They're just brought in right at the end. This is a huge problem with workflow and something that you should be focusing on. Jeffrey Zeltman said, content precedes design. Design in the absence of content is not design, it's decoration. And that was back in 2008. It's just as true today. Here's what happens when we don't have good workflow. This is another bank, First National Bank here in South Africa. Some content here from Trevor. This was live on their website. Apparently Trevor did not get the email or the notification that he was supposed to write something for this particular page on the website. That's a workflow problem. Somehow Trevor was actually not notified that he had to produce something and it needed to be inserted here before this page went live. Now, I really hope that poor Trevor has not been fired over the screenshot that's been doing the rounds, because it's not his fault, probably. It's the fault of poor workflow and poor processes. Here's another example. This is why I didn't study in 2011. UNISA is the University of South Africa, and I did study through them years ago. I wanted to do some more courses, but when I went to the registration page, I got the following information. My registration 2011 default content text. Not very helpful. Again, a workflow problem, because somehow this page went live. How did that happen? There was a hole in the workflow. Here's another example, again, a bank in South Africa. Do not browse the internet while logged onto your internet. Seems tricky to do it any other way, really. I think what happened is that the word banking got cut off at the end, and it should have said do not browse the internet while logged onto your internet banking, which is actually quite sage advice. But presumably the designer of this particular section of content and the person who wrote the content did not get together to discuss how big it needed to be, and the writer never actually saw it once they'd written the content. They didn't get a preview. So this happened. Again, this speaks to a workflow problem. So here are some questions that you can ask when you start to look into your workflow and figure out how it can be improved. You'll be asking content teams, what are your processes and tools? What's working? What's not? What does your team look like? In other words, who is on your team? How many people are there? What kind of roles do they hold? What other teams and departments do you work with? That's a really important question because that's where you start to understand where the gaps are, where communication is breaking down. Where are the bottlenecks? What are your challenges? A few more things about authorship. You'll want to start considering where the authors should sit in your organization. Will there be a central team? Should individual authors be within departments? And if so, who's going to oversee them? How are teams going to collaborate? How are content producers and content requesters going to collaborate? How can changes be communicated across departments? How will information be shared? Another focus area is managing and structuring your content assets, because content is an asset and we shouldn't lose sight of that. This quote is from Eric Hartman, who's a content strategist in the Netherlands. And he said content management is the systematic planning, development, organization, distribution, evaluation, and preservation of all information within an organization. There's a lot of rhyming going on there, but apart from that, I think we spend a lot of time on the development and the distribution parts, and we need to focus a little more on the planning, the organization, and the preservation parts when it comes to managing our content. Rachel Lavenger said that nimble content can travel freely, retain context and meaning, and create new products. So let's talk a little bit about what makes content nimble. Well, the model that everybody's been talking about for the last couple of years is COPE, create once, publish everywhere. In the past, we've worked with completed documents and pages, actual larger pieces of content, but we're moving more and more towards packages of reusable, related information. What COPE doesn't mean, it doesn't mean publishing the identical piece of content over and over on different platforms, but it means creating content in chunks, in related chunks that can be reused where and when appropriate, and creating them all simultaneously. So what do we need to do in order to be able to reuse our content? Well, we have to structure it properly. Content has to be well structured to be nimble, as Rachel was talking about, and future-proof. We have to consider and make explicit how and where different pieces of content can be used, and we do that through content models. We also use content models to define how different pieces and different chunks of content relate to one another, to keep track of their source and their provenance. So who has reviewed them, how often have they been reviewed, so on. We need to make sure that our content can be reused easily and, importantly, appropriately. Here's what happens when you don't structure your content properly, but you go ahead and reuse it anyway. This is from a Tumblr called Guardian Truncation Team. Unfortunately, it doesn't exist anymore, or maybe I should say fortunately, because the Guardian has actually fixed this particular problem. But it resulted in a lot of very amusing headlines, because what they were doing was they were just replicating their web headlines on mobile. And of course the headlines were being truncated on mobile because they hadn't written actual shorter headlines specifically for mobile. So police got called in to investigate criminal, which seems fairly normal. I don't quite know why that was newsworthy. BBC Director General failed to grasp gravity. Seems reasonable. I mean, he's the BBC director. I don't see why he should need to know anything about basic science. All right, let's move on. Focus area number 6 is proper content governance, and this is the thing that holds it all together. What is content governance? Rick Allen, also an independent content strategist, said that content governance is the process of managing content roles, responsibilities, workflow, documentation, and training. Let's look a little bit more closely at what it is. What is content governance about? Broadly, it's about who, what, when, and how. So we look at things like who has authoring and editing rights, who owns this piece of content, who has sign-off, who's responsible, who else needs to be involved, who needs to be notified of changes, and so on. What content lives on the homepage? What types of content do we not publish? What metadata do we need to capture? What resources should authors consult? When should content be updated? When should content be archived? When should it be reviewed? When should new content be created? These are all the questions that governance deals with. It also looks at things like how. How do we store our content? How do we name content items? How do we speak to various audiences? that would come back to voice and tone. How do we talk about ourselves in our industry, and how should content additions or changes be requested? These are just a few examples of the kind of issues that a good governance policy would include. There's also the political question of who has the final say when a disagreement or conflict of interests arises. So governance is really about pulling all of the decisions that you've made about how you're going to manage your content, what your workflow will look like, what your processes look like, and so on, what type of content you're going to publish, what your voice and tone is going to be like. It's all about pulling those things together and formalizing them, making them explicit so that you have something to actually look back to, and something that functions as a set of guidelines and principles for content planning and production in your organization. All right, we've covered a lot of ground. Are you all ready for a recap? I'm going to take that as a yes. I'm imagining that I can see you all nodding vigorously. So here are the things that you should not neglect in your rush to produce as much content as you can and to be exciting and fun and quirky. Don't neglect these basic things. Don't neglect your core content strategy. Make sure that you have that sorted out before you begin. Make it explicit. Write it down. Make sure that it's formalized and that every stakeholder agrees on it, that there is common ground. Don't neglect the needs of your audience. Speak to them. Find out what it is that they need. Don't give them the things that you wish they needed. Give them the things they really do need. Don't neglect voice and tone. You're going to come off as inauthentic. Make sure that your voice and your tone is an actual reflection of your company culture, and also that it's consistent. Don't neglect proper content structure, both visible and invisible. By visible, I mean navigation on your website, how the content is actually structured, what kind of subheadings and so on you use on your website. And invisible is the way that you have chunked and structured your content within your content management system. And internally, how you are thinking about content, how you've divided up content types and so on, and how you're modeling your content. Don't neglect all the small things that make for a good user experience. We looked at a bunch of examples of transactional type content, all those small signposts and labels and headings and so on. All of those things matter. They all add up to a good or a bad user experience, and they're really, really important. So don't neglect those small things. Don't let things like error messages slip through the cracks, because they can really adversely affect your user's experience. Don't neglect workflow and process, because if you do, people are going to get frustrated. They're going to find workarounds and hacks that might cost you money, cost you time. They might bring in some risk for the organization. So get your workflow and your process ironed out properly. Make sure that you actually have the resources available to create the content that you want to. And finally, don't neglect governance, because governance is the thing that underpins all of this. It's the thing that's going to hold it together. It's what's going to hold all your plans together and keep you on the right track. Thank you very much for listening. I think we have time for some questions. If anybody has any questions.
Yes, thank you so much, Kerry-Anne, excuse me. Definitely a very informative webinar. The first question that has been submitted is, if you have really limited resources and can focus on only one of these things, which should it be?
All right, so the first thing that I would say is that this is naturally going to vary a lot from organization to organization, depending on where you are, because organizations vary in their maturity. You know, you might have one area under control, and you may need to really focus on another area. But all things being equal, if you were holding a gun to my head and I really had to tell you exactly which one I think you should focus on first without any additional information, then I would say that you should be looking at your audience needs. That's where I would start. I would start by asking, what is it that they actually need to hear from us, and are we giving them the information they really, really need? Are we giving them the content that they need from us, or are we just kind of following our own path? So yeah, that's where I'd really start. I'd start with audience needs and looking at that and getting clear on what those are and making sure that you're actually satisfying them.
Thank you, Kerry-Anne. The next question has come in is, what if I understand all of this and really want to fix the basics, but my organization still thinks that content marketing and social media are our top priorities?
So that's quite a common problem, I think. Often the people who are attending conferences or listening to webinars do get this and are trying to figure out how to actually communicate it to the rest of their organization. So one of the things that I think tends to be quite effective is to use what we call wedge content strategy. So try to just get a little bit of this in somewhere. Try to find a place where you can squeeze something in, maybe piggyback on something else that's happening. Maybe there's some sort of content creation initiative happening or some content marketing drive or something going on, and you can piggyback on that. And then try to squeeze a little bit of this in. But the really important thing is that you don't waste that opportunity. You need to actually show some measurable results, because most often the people who you really need to convince will respond to data. That's kind of the most probable thing. They'll actually respond to data. So if you can show that something that you did that was something very basic actually had, like changing the text on a button or something, actually had a measurable impact on whatever metrics you have. So whether that's number of purchases or, the amount that's being purchased or the number of people signing up for something or whatever it is that you're measuring, if you can actually show that, you'll have a much better chance of persuading them of the value of these things and getting them to move away from just chasing the shiny, exciting things.
Excellent. Thank you, Kerry-Anne. The next question is, so are you saying that we should just stop doing content marketing altogether?
No, I'm not saying that. I think that content marketing certainly has its place, but here's the thing. I don't think that content marketing is new. I think it's a new name for something that's been done for a very, very long time. So I think sometimes about the recipe books that baking supply companies sent out. I mean, I have some from probably the 1930s in my house. That was content marketing. They were handing out recipes to sell their flour or their sugar or whatever it was. So I don't think it's so much a new thing. I think the new part of it is that there has been a focus on doing it relentlessly and aggressively. And that's the problem. I think when we focus on that above all else and neglect the things that I've mentioned earlier, that's when it becomes a problem. So no, don't stop using content as a marketing tool at all, by any means. But don't do it at the expense of other possibly more important things. It's really all about priorities. So just make sure that your priorities are in line. Make sure that you actually understand what the priorities are.
Great. Thank you so much, Kerry-Anne. At this time, that's all the questions that we received. I'll just wait a couple moments in case any more have come in. But in the meantime, I do want to let everyone know that our next webinar will be on Wednesday, January 7th at 1 p.m. Eastern Time. It will be titled Demystifying SPL for Medical Devices, and it's being presented by Ann Rockley, CEO of the Rockley Group, and Howard Schatz, Project Manager here at DCL. Just to let everyone know, I did receive a question. It'll be easy just to say it, that this presentation will be posted on SlideShare within the next 24 hours. And with that, I'm just going to give you a couple more seconds just to see if there's any other questions, Kerry-Anne. But I'd like to thank you for doing this webinar on behalf of us here at DCL and our audience. It was very informative, definitely very entertaining and engaging. And I would like to thank everyone for attending this webinar. This will conclude today's broadcast. You'll be able to access the recorded version of this webinar in the archive section of our website located at www.dclab.com. Thank you everyone for attending and have a great day.
Great. Thanks so much from my side as well. Thank you to everybody for spending some time with me this evening, and thank you to DCL for the opportunity to talk to you. Thanks, Adam.
You're welcome, Kerry-Anne. Thank you, everyone. Have a great one.
Bye-bye.